So, where does that leave Protestantism when we talk about theologies of inequality? Because Christianity is laden with the subjugation of the female. Of course, we talked about Saint Paul, but the Protestants, if you think back to the 19th century clergy, and many religious institutions are drawing off of ancient texts to shape their overall ideology. Those texts coming from the 17th century, the 16th century, the 18th century, the 19th century. So much of what we're interpreting as gospel today was written during times when men were clearly seen as being dominant over women. This 19th century clergy believed that women should not have the vote. They believed that women should not go to college. Women should not enter certain professions. Just so happens those professions are the most prestigious and powerful professions, and we're going to keep those solely for men. Their divinely created, frail constitutions prevented them from engaging in these types of professions. And as you can imagine, these religious doctrines are going to find their way into secular society. So it's not surprising that much of what we're going over right here feels like we've read this before. We saw the same arguments with women entering education, women entering the workforce. These arguments were being, in many respects, drawn out of the religious texts that any one particular religion uses to continue to create itself over time. And so if these doctrines were written during a time when males clearly saw themselves as superior to women, then the realities that they're going to create are going to lean heavily on this old interpretation, even as society changes. And we see this time and time again. Religions are going to be the last place that we see a change in this dominant subordinate relationship between men and women in our societies. Christianity, of course, some other things. Women, of course, ladies. You went and picked the apple. Got us cast out of Eden. Everything that's happened since we were in the Garden of Eden is your fault. If you wouldn't have done it, we wouldn't be here. Or at least that's what our religions would have us believe. That's what Christianity would have us believe. They're very much in support of celibacy, staying, not allowing sexual gratification. Of course, only men can be priests. And then you create these celibate men, and you can imagine that over time, their interpretations of women are going to be unfavorable, because in many respects, women for these priests represent the original sin, the desire that drives them crazy because of their maleness and their celibacy. And many of the sex scandals that have rocked the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, the Jewish Church, all of these institutions, but Catholics in particular, rely or can be drawn from this contradiction. What are we doing to priests when we do not allow them to marry? And I'm not saying that marriage in this case should be between a man and a woman. It could be, why can't a priest marry a gay man? Well, one of the reasons is because the way that religious doctrines are interpreted, that would be seen as going against the ways of God. So as societies change, religions are going to have a hard time with the new reality, and they're going to resist as long as possible. But hopefully, over time, they become much more accepting. We see this with Catholicism today. Um, the new pope is very, very open and willing to open a dialogue about how we see gender and how we define homosexuality and how inclusive or exclusive are we going to be in reference to the other. So if Catholicism can begin to change, and I'm not saying that it's changed completely, but when the Pope says we are now more accepting of gays, that's a huge thing for the Catholic Church. And it is a sign that there's some cracks in the foundations of traditional stereotypical constructions of gender in our society. We also find, the contradiction of gender in fundamentalist Islam. Women must cover themselves in public, um, uh, mostly because if men saw them, they would lose their minds and could not control themselves, and therefore we need to cover our women to prevent men from falling prey to their emotional desires and their physical desires. We also find that men must wear beards. They cannot shave. This is because Muhammad was thought of wearing a beard, and if the Prophet Muhammad wore a beard, then every man should wear a beard as well. And the ramifications of a person cutting a man's beard, for example, a barber or something like that, cutting off someone's beard is severe, most likely resulting in death. And of course, homosexuality is something that many of the major religions, especially the monotheistic religions, are having a hard time wrapping their minds around. As society as a whole begins to accept the gay, lesbian, transsexual, queer community, these institutions will soften their positions. But when religious institutions are experiencing massive transformations within their doctrines, at times they latch on to those that to one or two, and they hold on to it longer than many of the others. And this aversion to homosexuality might be what we're seeing in our religious institutions as we speak. Okay, we'll be more gender equal, but we certainly can't be allowing gay people into our church. And I guess many of these things are going to change simply because our population's beliefs are going to change over time. The religiosity of gender tells us that many religions promote gender difference and male domination. And the irony of that is, even in the midst of male-dominated gendered institutions, we find more women are religious than men. So even as they're being told they should be subjugated to men, more women are participating in the religious institutions than are men. We know that women are more likely to practice religion, they're more likely to pray, they're more likely to read the Bible, and they're more likely to attend services. Men, on the other hand, are more likely to claim no religious affiliation. And this is a problem for religions. This is something that we find religions returning to over and over, on how we get men to accept God back into their lives. Men are much more likely to move away from the church than they over the course of their life than they are to stay with the church. Historically, black churches, women make up 70 to 90% of the congregation. And fundamentalism seeks to return women to their rightful place. So as you can imagine, we need to see gender in religion. We need to see religion as a gendered institution. Um, After all, religion is nothing more than a social institution itself. Um, there's somewhat of a symmetry between religious doctrine and the institutional practices that come out of those religious doctrines. As we talked about, the ironies of the male-dominated perspectives offered to us by religious organizations, especially the monotheistic religions, but we still see women participating more than men. Though the law forbids it, religious institutions can use gender as a criteria for hiring and firing. And today, we're giving even more power to religious institutions. Donald Trump just made some statements, made some executive orders about healthcare. He's allowing religious institutions to not have to cover birth control, not have to do many of the things that they feel are against their own religious doctrine, even though many of the people that might be working at those religious institutions are ultimately atheist. If you're working for a Jewish hospital, you're a doctor at a Jewish hospital, or you're a doctor at a Christian hospital, you might not be Christian, and therefore you might want to have condom use or birth control or things like that. But religion has a friend in Donald Trump in this regard. And so despite how religion has used a perspective of domination over men over women, we're still seeing changes. As I mentioned, religious institutions are going to ultimately change with the beliefs of the people in the societies that support them, and you're going to see predictable changes. So we see the percentage of women seeking divinity degrees is increasing. That partially might be because the percentage of women in college is now more than men. And so as more women go to college, likely you're going to see an increase in women getting divinity degrees, especially since most women, or much of the population that is religious, are women. Reform Judaism allows women, gays, lesbians, and queers to be rabbis. That's a big step in the right direction. Some Protestant denominations allow women to minister, Lutheran Episcopal churches, and some even permit gays and lesbians to minister. Once again, cracks in the foundation, folks. If Protestants and Jews are changing their long-standing religious doctrine, they're doing it for reasons. And that is because their numbers are beginning to diminish due to the fact that the beliefs of the religious ideologies themselves no longer resonate with the people. And when that happens, either one of two things is going to happen. You're going to see people move away from Judaism or Christianity or Catholicism or Islam. And if there's not a response from the religious institutions themselves, then those people that are moving away will ultimately diminish the religious institutions over time. And if the religions want to keep their parishioners, then they're going to have to change what they think. We also know that religious institutions do all kinds of good stuff. I'm not here to bash religion. I'm here to talk about the inequality that's embedded in religion. But it is no surprise, and most people understand that much of what happens at the civic level has a church involved in it one way or another. So essentially, gender and religiosity pose two problems.